So let's now return to the question of whether or not cannabis and its different components increase creativity. And when you look at the literature on this, you find studies that very clearly point to a yes, it increases creativity. And it's not surprising, therefore, that cannabis can increase dopamine transmission, that is dopamine levels, in certain brain areas, in particular brain areas involved in thinking and planning. Okay, so cannabis increases dopamine in these areas. Elevated dopamine increases divergent thinking, and divergent thinking is associated with creativity. And there are studies that support the idea that cannabis can increase creativity. However, there are at least as many studies that say that cannabis does not increase creativity, that cannabis increases consideration of multiple ideas, perhaps through elevation of dopamine and related systems, but that ultimately the ideas that converge from that are not truly creative ideas. At least they don't meet the criteria for creative brainstorming and extraction of ideas that are truly novel. So it doesn't increase creativity. So which one is it? Well, fortunately, there's an entirely distinct set of literature that has taken all the other literature into consideration, and here's where we arrive. So there's a really nice study that explored creativity in cannabis users, and we will provide a link to this study. First author is Emily LaFrance, and the title of the paper is somewhat amusing in its own right, which is, it starts with a question. Inspired by Mary Jane, of course, Mary Jane being one of the kind of old school versions of or ways of talking about cannabis or marijuana. Nowadays, people refer to it mainly as pot, has other names too, of course. And the title of the paper is Inspired by Mary Jane, Mechanisms Underlying Enhanced Creativity in Cannabis Users. And I really like this study for a couple of reasons. First of all, they looked at people who did not use cannabis as well as people who used cannabis. So they had two different groups, but they did not evaluate creativity of the cannabis users while they were under the influence of cannabis. They looked at the level of creativity in these cannabis users when they were not under the influence of cannabis and asked whether or not their ability to be creative was enhanced by cannabis. Now, we're going to compare this to studies in which people come into the laboratory and actually use cannabis, and then they evaluate creativity under that context. But this study has some unique takeaways that I think are really interesting. First of all, they did, yes, see evidence for enhanced creativity. And when I say enhanced creativity, I mean within the context of this divergent thinking thing that I talked about a moment ago. And when I say enhanced, I mean significantly greater than in non-users, so people that don't use cannabis. So right now I can imagine that all the cannabis users are cheering, yes, cannabis increases creativity, makes people more creative than they would be otherwise. Well, this is interesting. We have to ask ourselves how that was accomplished. And it turns out that one of the major ways in which it was accomplished is that cannabis users, even if they are not under the influence of cannabis, are far more open to novel ideas, and they have a more explorative and sort of reduced anxiety, or I should say lower anxiety mode of thinking when they explore novel ideas, which is essential for divergent thinking. So they observe both enhanced divergent and convergent creative type thinking in cannabis users. And the source of that, they conclude, is, and here I'll just quote, cannabis users' higher levels of openness to experience are responsible for their enhanced self-reported creativity and convergent thinking test performance. So it's not necessarily that cannabis is increasing the capacity of the brain areas that are associated with creativity, but rather cannabis appears to be increasing an openness, and probably doing that in part through lowering anxiety in particular people. And that openness is leading to inclusion of more ideas during the divergent thinking process, right? They're willing to consider throwing up more things on the wall to see if they stick, so to speak. So in their conclusions, they have a really nice statement. Again, I'll just read from the paper because they said it better than I ever could. Quote, while mainstream media has propagated the idea that cannabis expands the mind and enhances creativity, our results show the link between cannabis and creativity is largely a spurious correlation, meaning that it's not the case that cannabis increases creativity. But, and I inserted the but in this quote, but driven by differences in personality that are related to cannabis use. For example, openness to experience that are related to both cannabis use and augmented creativity. This is a real chicken egg argument. What do I mean by that? What I mean is This paper finds that people who are more open to experience are more likely to use cannabis, and people who use cannabis are going to be more open to new experiences. And that combination of features, openness to experience and what that openness to new experiences brings, enhances the convergent and divergent thinking that is characteristic of the creative process. So in short, cannabis increases creativity, but through changes in personality that tap into the creative process rather than directly impacting the neural circuits that, for instance, turn on creativity. And I have to say, this study is really important because by exploring cannabis users not while under the influence of cannabis, they were able to tap into this very important, what I believe to be fact. Because if you think about a study in which you would have one group using cannabis and another group not using cannabis, and then you give them some task that taps into creativity, you will see effects, and very likely you'll see effects where cannabis might even increase divergent, convergent thinking and creativity. Those results have actually been published many times before. But given the varied effects of cannabis and THC that we talked about earlier through all of that complex signaling stuff, you can imagine that there will also be other studies, and in fact there are, where divergent and convergent thinking and creativity is not assisted by cannabis and might even be reduced by ingesting cannabis. However, if one considers that divergent thinking is absolutely crucial to the creativity process, and the range of things that one will explore will be enhanced by openness and by reduced levels of anxiety, so a willingness to explore different options, some of which might seem completely crazy, and cannabis increases the personality types and reduces the anxiety that create that sense of openness, well, then it makes perfect sense why cannabis would increase creativity in certain individuals, but not directly. And this study, the one I just referred to, which I should say was published in the journal Consciousness and Cognition, and again, we'll provide a link to it, did a wonderful job of teasing out this impact of cannabis on personality, which then impacts creativity. So if somebody asks you, or if you're wondering, or if you feel like cannabis increases creativity, in some sense, the answer is yes, but the answer is yes because of the ways that it shapes openness to new ideas and can because not in everybody, but can in some individuals reduce anxiety. What this means is that if you are somebody who experiences anxiety or increased levels of focus from cannabis, regardless of the strain, and here I have to imagine people are exploring different strains if they're exploring them at all, exploring different modes of delivery, smoking or ingestible, et cetera. If you're somebody who experiences anxiety, it's very likely that you won't have the increased openness to experience and divergent ideas that will facilitate creativity. However, if you are somebody who achieves heightened levels of relaxation and reduced levels of anxiety from cannabis, regardless of which strain we happen to be talking about, well then, yes, it will position you to be in a heightened state of creativity, at least as defined by convergent and divergent thinking. One of the more characteristic, or I should say stereotype, qualities of people that smoke a lot of marijuana or ingest cannabis through other means is their changed patterns of speech. In fact, there's a kind of a lore in the clinical realm that you can predict or get some strong indication as to whether or not somebody is a cannabis user, a pot smoker, based on their voice and their particular tone of voice and their lack of inflection. There's a lot of speculation here, but fortunately it's been studied. So I'd like to discuss now whether or not cannabis can impact patterns of speech, both acutely, meaning while under the influence of cannabis, and over time in chronic cannabis users. And when I say chronic cannabis use, I want to be very specific what I mean. Chronic cannabis use does not necessarily mean that people are smoking cannabis or ingesting cannabis every day. Although certainly if they are, that qualifies as chronic use. Chronic use is regular use over time of anywhere from twice a week or more. So using cannabis once a month would not be considered chronic use, even if it's for many, many years. Using cannabis or ingesting cannabis in some way or form twice a week would be considered chronic use. Then, of course, some of you out there are going to ask me to split hairs and say, well, what if somebody uses it twice a month? Well, listen, the clinical literature and the scientific literature don't get that specific. And of course, there are an infinite number of ways to arrange one's cannabis use, everything from zero, none at all, to constantly, every day, all day. and everywhere in between. But think of chronic use as twice a week or more. Think of occasional use as less than that, and realize that within the realm of chronic use, that or more can be anywhere from twice a week to every day to just in the evenings, etc. The effects of chronic use of cannabis, as I just defined it, on speech have been studied because of this characteristic drawing out of certain syllables, a slowing of speech, and in many cases, a total change or alteration in the way that people speak and use language, both when under the influence of cannabis and when not under the influence of cannabis, if they are chronic users. And here we really want to distinguish between THC and CBD and just make it really simple and say that CBD is not responsible for most of the psychoactive effects of cannabis, whereas THC is. And again, the ratio of CBD to THC is going to be relevant there, but let's just think about cannabis and THC as one and the same for this portion of the discussion, realizing that, of course, they are not exactly the same thing. There's an excellent study entitled Adults with History of Recreational Cannabis Use Have Altered Speech Production. And we will provide a link to that. First author, Adam Vogel. Really like this paper. It was published in the journal Drug and Alcohol Dependence. We will provide a link to it for you if you'd like to peruse it in more detail. The title itself, Adults with a History of Recreational Cannabis Use Have Altered Speech Production, tells you pretty much everything you need to know, except there's some important nuance in here because, as I mentioned earlier, people who smoke sativa varieties of cannabis oftentimes will become more talkative, much more talkative. However, whether or not people tend to rely on sativa cannabis use or indica cannabis use, there is a very consistent finding that people who are chronic users, again, twice a week or more, recreational use or medicinal use, undergo pretty profound changes in the way that they speak, but in a very specific set of ways. Now, first of all, the changes in speech shouldn't surprise us at all because both sativa varieties of cannabis and indica varieties of cannabis impact those brain centers involved in movement, the basal ganglia. Remember the go, no-go circuitry, the circuitry that makes you want to do things and the circuitry that makes you want to withhold action. And it tends to shift the body and brain toward more inaction. And cannabis impacts CB1 receptors in the cerebellum, which is involved in motor planning, execution, and balance. So regardless of whether or not people are using cannabis of the sativa or the indica variety, there are disruptions in motor circuitry. And as you may have heard if you listen to our episode with Rockefeller professor Dr. Eric Jarvis, who works on speech and movement, speech is movement, right? The movements of the mouth, the movements of the hands, those are intimately related in terms of our speech. In fact, the centers of the brain involved in hand movements are part of the speech areas and vice versa. Eric actually pointed out that if you put your hands behind your back, provided you normally do have use of your hands, it actually will reduce your fluidity of speech. And so I'm going to put them back in front of me now. The point is, smoking marijuana or consuming marijuana by edible changes one's speech and does it in a very specific way. And in this study by Adam Vogel and colleagues, they explored a huge different variety of aspects of speech. And this can be done using spectral processing, which is, fancy nerd speak for looking at how much inflection there is or looking at how long people hold vowels or consonants, etc. And again, these are people not under the influence of cannabis, but rather people who tend to be under the influence of cannabis when not participating in the study. In other words, chronic recreational cannabis users. So what are the two major shifts that cannabis causes on our patterns of speech? Well, the first one is a change in what's called spectral tilt. Again, that's fancy nerd speak for vocal effort and intensity. So I'm not a pot smoker, I confess. But if I were to say the sentence, vocal effort and intensity are important components of speech, that's the way I would say that sentence if I was striving to enunciate very carefully and to accent certain words and syllables. A pot smoker or somebody who uses recreational cannabis fairly often would have reduced spectral tilt, aka vocal effort intensity, and might say, spectral tilt is vocal effort and intensity. and it differed between groups and appeared to change in line with the duration of abstinence from cannabis use. That, I think, is not a far cry from the change in spectral tilt that they observed here. In addition, there are changes in verbal timing. That is, pronunciation of words and accenting particular syllables of words in people that consume cannabis or smoke cannabis. So rather than emphasize particular words within a sentence, so again, I'll just use a sentence from the paper so that you can gain more knowledge from the paper. Cannabis, and I'll say it the way that I would say it since I'm not a cannabis user. Cannabis, marijuana, is the most commonly used illicit drug in the world, with approximately 4% of adults aged 15 to 64 years reporting recent use. And the citation is from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, 2019. So that would be the way that I would typically read that sentence. And having gone into the data on this paper and, of course, evaluated references therein and listened to some of the spectral analysis that they include as data, you can literally go into these papers online and hear recordings of people who are cannabis users or non-cannabis users. And I'll try and give you a clear sense, without picking an extreme example, of how somebody who's a fairly consistent or even occasional cannabis user might read that very same sentence. Cannabis, marijuana, is the most commonly used illicit drug in the world, with approximately 4% of adults aged 15 to 64 years reporting recent use. And the citation comes from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, 2019. Now, you'll notice that wasn't a dramatic difference. And of course, I could have taken the liberty to pick an extreme example of the sort that they did occasionally observe in evaluating subjects for this paper. I could have said something like, cannabis, marijuana is the most commonly used illicit drug. But frankly, that would have been selecting an outlier example, and I don't want to do that. I don't want to skew the data, as they say. Rather, if you heard the first time I read the sentence and the second time I read the sentence, what's mainly different is the difference in the amount of enunciation and accenting of particular words and symbols within a sentence. So the total content that's delivered is exactly the same. And while I wasn't measuring my pace, the overall rate of communication is essentially the same. But there's less sort of lilting and falling of the voice and less accenting. That's the major consistent effect of cannabis use. Now, of course, there are examples of people who are using a lot of cannabis and it impacts brain centers involved in movement and speech, so much so that they really do have the really drawn out kind of nah. And oftentimes this will be detected in the laugh. You know, there's this sort of stereotypical stoner laugh, as it's sometimes called, rather than say, ha, 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 or that's a fake laugh, obviously. It's hard to make myself laugh if something's not actually funny. I have to think of something funny. When people say, like that's a bit more of the way I might laugh, like sort of the inspiratory laugh, or the, which is expiratory laugh. People who use cannabis chronically will often do the right, which is sort of the back of the throat. It's sort of this it's neither inspiratory nor expiratory laugh. And believe it or not, there's an entire literature on inspiratory, inhaling, versus expiratory laughs. And there's also a literature on cannabis altering the pattern of inspiratory and expiratory laughs. It almost sounds like a sarcastic laugh, when in fact they may not be feeling sarcastic at all. And I have a very close friend and colleague who's a phenomenal neurosurgeon and neuroscientist by the name of Dr. Eddie Chang. He's the chair of neurosurgery at UCSF, and his lab and him are expert in the study of neuroscience controlling language and speech. And he often tells me that he can predict with almost certainty whether or not somebody is a regular cannabis user based not just on the patterns of speech that they use, but even just by recording specific neurons in their brain that underlie the laugh reflex and certain patterns of speech. So this idea that cannabis use changes your ability to speak and enunciate clearly does appear to be true. And the stereotype that cannabis use tends to create more of a drawl or kind of a if you will, a laziness in the laugh and some of the reflexive enunciations that people use does also appear to be true. And I say all that, of course, with the caveat that many people out there will know individuals, or perhaps you yourselves are individuals that may use cannabis, but that have incredible articulation, probably better than mine and better than other people out there who speak for a living. So I'm not saying that 100% of people that use cannabis regularly can't speak well or clearly. That's simply not what I'm saying, and I don't want to communicate that idea at all. But it is the case that people who are regular cannabis users are impacting the neural circuits involved in movement. Movement also controls speech, and therefore cannabis is impacting speech.